In the last lecture, in both the landscape photos and the artworks, we saw how color creates a quality of light and mood. And mood is an important consideration in making a drawing. It will lead us to select a specific palette. Each of the images we looked at have this, a specific palette that creates a mood. Within the confines of the palette, we can create a visual hierarchy. We use color and value, that's part of color, to create focal areas and focal points, and attend to the illusion of space, volume, and light, like we did with the value palette. As you begin to work with color, it's a good idea to pay attention to your everyday feelings surrounding color palettes and mood. Many people viscerally feel different between a blue sky and a cloudy one, or the difference between a field of flowers in the afternoon sun and a dingy bus station at night illuminated by weak fluorescence. Why do some places feel uplifting, romantic, scary, or depressing? Analyze what's going on in terms of color, and you'll have excellent material at your disposal. You actually know a lot more about certain aspects of color than you might think. You coordinate the colors of the clothes you wear on a daily basis: shirt and pants, suit and tie, dress, handbag, and shoes. These are all examples of coordinating color and projecting mood or setting a tone based on palette. Business attire projects a mood through palette: serious, sober. The palette's fairly neutral, achromatic. Casual business attire projects a different mood. The color sends a different signal, as does an evening gown. And golf clothes another, palette's more saturated. Kids' clothes are often even more so. And clowns are like a whole kid's closet all mashed up, kind of anarchic. Similarly, you've likely thought about mood and palette in decorating your home or office. You've coordinated the color of your walls and flooring and furnishings. A brown study, a pink bedroom, and a sleek, neutral living room all have different palettes. They project different moods. We're also constantly barraged with the works of professional designers and illustrators who are putting color to work to create mood and evoke an emotional response in order to sell us things. Many good examples can be found in the cereal aisle of the supermarket. The Sweet Kids cereals are packaged with bright, saturated colors. The mood's upbeat and fun, like a lot of kids' clothes, toys, and cartoons. Healthy, whole grain, high fiber cereals targeted at adults are packaged in much more neutral boxes. Here, serious brown ochres dominate. The colors earth and grain, nothing sweet, nothing artificial. Same's true of greeting cards. Next opportunity, compare the kids' birthday cards with condolence cards. The former have a lot in common with kids' cereal boxes. The latter are generally much less saturated, often soft pastels. So take a look around your home or office. Analyze the palettes in individual objects, in clothing or in entire rooms. Then make swatches of color to represent the palette of what you've analyzed. In the last lecture, we saw how a sense of light, mood, and emotion can be affected through palette choice. The essential character of a palette is defined through limitation. Limitation is key. If we throw every color at a drawing or painting, they tend to cancel each other out. If we copy colors indiscriminately, we lose control of mood and hierarchy. There are certain common types of palettes that artists have used for centuries. It would be a good idea as we go through these to make swatches of color to represent the palette of each work. Perhaps the most simple color limitation is to use one chroma. We refer to this as a monochromatic palette. This well-known example is by Ingres. Picasso's Guernica is another famous monochromatic work. The contemporary American artist Mark Tansey works just about solely in monochromes, from blues to greens to oranges and reds. This is really a form of working with value, though hue plays its part. A blue painting will feel different, cooler, more icy, less humid than a warm gray, much less an orange painting. An expanded monochrome palette admits a bit of color outside the monochrome. Whistler was supremely conscious of color. His painting, known colloquially as Whistler's Mother, was actually titled Arrangement in Gray and Black No. 1. He titled many of his paintings to reference specific palette limitations. While in London, he did a group of color studies of the Thames at night and in early morning, like this one titled Nocturne in Blue and Silver. It represents a subtle variation on a dark, cool monochrome to incorporate small traces of warm lights. Degas uses an expanded monochrome on the warm side of the spectrum here. Looking at these two works, you can really appreciate Leonardo's notebook entries on the subject. Colors of individual things partake of the color of the light, and color reflects from one object to another. The more you look for this, the more you'll see well beyond the local color of individual objects. You'll see how environmental factors of light and reflection permeate the scene before you. Related to both the monochrome and expanded monochrome palette is the dominant hue palette. Let's say I want a palette where yellow is dominant. I could take a group of colors, like the range of primaries and secondaries, and add a sufficient quantity of yellow to each so that when they're put into action, yellow will be the dominant hue, or green, or red-violet. And you can do this to varying degrees, and vary value and saturation as well. This portrait by Whistler exemplifies the approach. While there are yellows, earth tones, and darks which have admixtures of cools, the predominant hue is red. A next step in palette complexity is the analogous palette. Here, Monet uses a blue-violet-red palette for this 1904 painting of the Houses of Parliament. Though there are some blues, the painting has a strong violet-red presence. You'll also note that the values of the color are all pretty close in the mid and mid-dark range. As with a number of Monet's paintings, there are multiple versions of the scene. I've counted at least 19. Each uses a different set of palette limitations to create the sense of mood, season, time of day, and atmospheric conditions. Moving clockwise around the wheel from violet-red, Cezanne uses an analogous orange-yellow-green. Here, the value is mostly in the mid-range. Delacroix, in a more neutral range, takes us the next step around the circle in this watercolor, analogous yellow-green and into blue. And Monet completes the circle with his view of Waterloo Bridge, London, at dusk, green, blue, violet. Though much more saturated than the Delacroix, it feels like a whisper because the value range is so close, mostly in light to mid-range. I hope you're beginning to get a feel for the personalities of these palettes. Each has a specific and different flavor. Another very common palette is one based on complements. This Degas uses a yellow-violet complementary system. Try to imagine it without the figures, pretty much a yellow painting, though most of the yellows are fairly neutral, listing to tan or ochre, earth tones. Our earth tones themselves are very important. We can mix them with primary, secondary, and tertiary colors to make them more neutral. Yellow with yellow ochre or Van Dyke brown will give us a neutral yellow. The figures, most dressed nominally in white, list to the violet, light and fairly neutral. Also note that the door on the left, the central decorative framing of the doors, and the molding at the top of the walls has admixtures of yellow, violet, and the yellow earth, pretty neutral. This Turner is also a yellow-violet painting, but the violet is warmer, more toward the red, and just about everything is very neutral. In contrast, this yellow-violet Wayne Thiebaud is pumped. Actually, the ground is modest, a light violet. The high saturations are saved for the malts. Excellent hierarchical use of saturation and value contrast to create a focal area. The essential point here is that a yellow-violet palette, or any palette for that matter, is not one thing. It can be pulled in many different directions, each one with a different mood or flavor. And I hope you see how environmental light and mood are tied to palette, whether indoors or outdoors. It's all about defining a range of value and saturation within a palette limitation. There are endless permutations within any given palette, whether it's monochromatic, analogous, or complementary. Traveling around the globe to the Netherlands, we get Vermeer employing an orange-blue limitation. The woman's jacket is a somewhat neutral blue, and the sliver of abdomen we see is orange. But look at the back edge of the table. It's a neutral orange against a neutral blue-gray wall. Her skirt's treated in neutral oranges with shadows that have admixtures of cooler blue. The painting, A Last Judgment, behind her is similarly rendered in neutral oranges and blues, as is the tiled floor under the table. We get a different blue-orange palette in this 18th century pastel by Rosalba Carriera. The ground's a neutral more towards the blue, but with hints of warm. Why don't the complements in the ground create a lot of contrast? Because they're similar in neutrality and in value. They've been made to share qualities. All the high-value contrast and vivid saturation go to the figure's head. Whistler shifts the orange and blues farther into the neutrals. He calls this mother of pearl and silver. You'll notice that Vermeer, Carriera, Whistler all follow the same solid strategy. Greater saturation and value contrast in the objects, less in the ground. These photos that we looked at earlier, also orange-blue, embrace the same organizational principle. The Canalero that we've looked at repeatedly also operates in neutral orange-blue. The sky and the domes of St. Mark's Cathedral are mostly cool. The whole bottom section and tower neutral warm. I'd call this orange-blue, though the piazza's pavement extends a bit into the red. Odilon-Redon takes the same palette but pumps the saturation. And let's look at our last complementary pair, red and green. Here decidedly neutral in Robert Nanteuil's pastel. The ground neutral green, the flesh towards the red, but the flesh in the shadow goes towards the green. Here's another portrait by Gilbert Stuart, the 18th century American famous for his portraits of George Washington. Here the range is much more saturated. A lot of it clearly announces itself as red or green. But pay attention to the quote-unquote white dress. It's primarily rendered in species of green. Akins also opts for red-green here. Imagine it without the objects in Kidd. The upper ground shape green, the bottom red, both toward the neutral, and squint, both similar in value. Result, not too much contrast. Give the Kidd and the objects higher value contrast and some pump saturation. That's color working compositionally. And we'll revisit Monet here in Venice. His green-red takes the reds towards the violet. And another permutation, a drawing by Turner, a pinkish ground, all very light, with our major event, the boat and related sky, receiving the saturation and value contrast. The examples we've looked at so far are all Western, but these palette ideas are much more widespread. This is a section of a Ming Dynasty, late 16th century hand scroll. It employs a red-green complementary system, neutral red-browns in the tree trunk and side planes of the exposed earth. In the ground, greater saturation in the seated Lohan's robes. A related color palette is the split complementary palette, a yellow with both red-violet and a blue-violet as an example, or a red with a yellow-green and a blue-green, or a blue with a yellow-orange and a red-orange. You could make some swatches of those palettes. David's Oath of the Horatii is based in both red-green and orange-blue. Some of the color's obvious, but a lot of the color here is subtle, neutral. At first you might not recognize the hue. Look at the center female figure's skirt. That's a neutral orange, the upper part of her garment a neutral blue. Or look at the herringbone pattern on the floor, basically a neutral red. The columns a dark neutral blue. The arches above, neutral reds. Akins is also straddling red, green, orange, blue. The sky's blue with traces of orange. The thin landscape, a neutral orange-green. The water, blue-green and orange. The skulls are orange and red earths. The flesh is modulated white and red or orange to neutrals tinged with blue. This early 15th century Chinese scroll, 18 Songs of a Nomad Flute, the story of Lady Wenji, uses a similar set of palette restrictions, red-green, orange-blue. The ground shifts from neutral orange to neutral green in a consistently light value range. The tents, figures, and other important elements get the higher saturations and greater value contrast to the ground. This late 16th century Indian example from the court of Akbar the Great employs a similar red-green, orange-blue palette. Again, more neutral in the ground and more saturated in the figures. Van Gogh's The Night Cafe uses a similar palette, but here the color's much more saturated, and the greens are extending into the yellow, giving it a somewhat acidic feel. Modigliani dwells mostly in the hot colors, goes with the subject, reds in the drape to oranges in the flesh. He introduces a single blue event, mid-dark in the pillow, a complement to the light flesh's orange. This sets off the model's head and chest, the focal area. He uses the deep dark values in the head and around the neck and chest to further this emphasis. Another palette variation is the neutral earth tone palette. Here's Picasso's 1910 portrait of the art dealer Ambroise Vollard. You'll note that the head is mostly warm, everything else much more neutral and cool. We could also conceive of this as a species of an orange-blue or red-green complementary system. This type of palette was used quite a bit by Picasso, Georges Braque, and Juan Gris, and others during the heyday of Cubism. In some examples, you don't get much of the warms at all. In others, the warmers dominate. In an earlier lecture, we saw how we could mix complements to produce colors that were more neutral. We also learned how we could use more neutral versions of the primaries and secondaries to get further neutrality. We can extend on this using earth colors. Each of the warms has a sister earth color. You can think about these as less saturated versions of the primary and secondary colors themselves. For yellow, we have colors like yellow ochre. For orange, those like raw sienna. For red, those like burnt sienna. Mix your violet, blue, and green with their complementary earth, and you'll get an earth variant of the true complement. A variant on this is to mix a second earth, a darker neutral earth, with the cool and warm earth. Or with the cool alone. And you can also use white and grays to further neutralize these colors. There are another set of factors we want to be aware of in considering color. This has to do with the relationship of color to shape. We can have flat color, broad areas of unmodulated color enclosed in shape, or to put it another way, defining the edges of a shape. In Van Gogh's The Night Café, much of the color functions this way. The red fills the shape of the wall, the light blue, the tabletops, the mustard green, the side plane of the pool table. This is the way many of us colored in a picture when we were kids. Draw the shape of the apple and color it in red. In contrast to flat color, we have open color, like in this Monet. Here, within the shapes, the sky, the water, the planes of the bridge, we see a range of color, greens, blues, and violets. Here there are marks and multiple little areas of color within the shapes, and the edges of the shapes themselves are much less strictly defined. The approach is very common when areas or surfaces are built out of mark and the sensation of color depends on optical mixing, meaning our eye perceives blue-green where there are lots of individual blue and green marks or smudges in an area, or orange when there's red and yellow. Same idea as in Seurat's use of colored dots. Another way in which shapes are treated with color is through gradation. Take a look at the upper section of the back wall in this Vermeer, between the orange curtain and the painting. First, there's a gradation from light to a mid-dark. That's the shadow of the curtain. Then from that neutral, cool mid-dark to a lighter warm. That's the reflection of the curtain. Then cooler and more neutral, getting lighter as we move toward the painting's frame. We're likely experiencing the effects of simultaneous contrast here. The dark frame is making the wall seem lighter. The wall is making the frame appear darker. We feel similar gradations in the woman's skin and garments and many of the other surfaces. This approach is most common in naturalistic work, like in Vermeer and Eakins, where the goal is to create a convincing illusion of three-dimensional form and space. To recap, in a given shape or area, we can have flat color, multiple colors, or gradations. Some artists and traditions use one approach, others combine them. Take Van Gogh, for instance. Flat color in the walls, but marks of different color in the floor, and something in between on the pool table surface. Modigliani mixes it up too. We get some real gradations in the woman's torso suggesting three-dimensional volume. But that's about the only place. The rest is pretty flat. While we get some mark making in the bed, the red is pretty much flat color within a shape, as is the dark pillow and the woman's hair and eyes. Certain artists and traditions embrace flat color palettes. Let's return to Ugolino's Last Supper. If we remove the figures and all the stuff on the table, we'd have a more or less orange, yellow, blue-violet complementary palette. The back wall and floor are blue-violet neutrals. The right side wall, the tablecloth, and the bench are orange-yellow. While the figures' robes are modulated, they act a lot like flat color: red, blue, green, orange, and a dark cool. That's because they're modulated tonally. They get lighter or darker, but within a garment shape, there's no color change. The colors themselves are repeated rhythmically across the surface. The eye tends to connect the similar colors and moves us around the table. Court ladies preparing silk functions in a similar way. Here too, the ground is fairly neutral and mid-tone. The ladies' hair and heads pop light and dark against the mid-tone ground, and the colors of their robes, blues, reds, pinks, and greens, are much more saturated than the ground. They repeat rhythmically and move us back and forth through the painting. One of the hallmarks of this use of color is that it's non-Leonardian. The colors of individual things don't partake of the color of a light source, nor does color reflect from one object to another. Color remains in its bounded shape. While there's much more gradation in Raphael's School of Athens, the color is set up in a similar way. Take the figures away, it's all neutral. The figures' drapes carry all the saturation, and the colors repeat rhythmically across the surface. For instance, take a look at the light blue drapes and how they choreograph your movement through the painting. Bruegel was one of the great practitioners of this use of color. Here, in children's games, the ground is mostly earth tones, pretty neutral. The figures get most of the saturation. Yellows, reds, blues, greens, and other colors move us around the surface. And Mondrian uses color in a similar way. Let's sum up a couple principles here. When using color, a first and defining choice is palette selection, or color limitation, because that gives us light, mood, and emotion, the overall flavor of the work. It could be cool, acidic, or any number of other things. Once we've made that decision, the next step is to think hierarchically and compositionally, thinking about relative contrast, meaning we're considering relative hue, value, and saturation contextually. And this is something you already know something about. You experience it every day. Why are stop signs red and white? Because there's very little red in nature, so it will have a lot of contrast to its likely color environment in the country. And similarly, there's not a lot of saturated red in most cities, so it'll get our attention. Why the white? Because it's really different than red. It's very light and totally unsaturated, so lots of contrast. You can't not notice the word stop. Same principles used in advertising all the time. This photo is highly organized. Why do we go to the lips first? Highest saturation. They're also in the center. Then the sunglasses, lots of light-dark contrast. Diminishing amounts of saturation and value contrast as we move to the head. And least saturation and contrast in the ground. It's all neutral. Most people will dependably move through the photo in that order. Let's take a closer look at how artists use color hierarchically and in relation to broader compositional considerations. In this Cézanne, the pairs are the focus. They're the objects. They're in the center, and they overlap the table, partially obscuring it, so they win out over the table. And the use of color is making a contribution too. The pairs are yellow and green, the table orange and green. Now, at first you might think orange and green should have greater contrast because yellow and green are analogous, and there's red and orange and green and red are complements. So what's going on? Well, for one thing, the yellow and green in the pairs is more highly saturated than the orange and green in the tabletop. Why? Because the green has a bit of orange in it, and the orange has some green. And the green and orange are also very similar in value, while the yellow and green of the pairs has a higher value contrast. And the value contrast of the pairs to the ground is accentuated by the thin slivers of dark green related to the pair's edges. On the underside of the pairs, these act as cast shadows. Higher saturation and value contrast add up to focal zone. Let's take a look at the Vermeer in this regard. Squint at it. It helps to suppress details. Notice that the highest contrast is one of light to dark. The light shape is composed of the woman's headscarf, head and neck, down to the white fur front of her jacket. The light shape is framed by the similar darks of the painting behind her, the shadow side of her headscarf and dark jacket. There's not a single contrast in the painting that can top this. Makes sense. The painting's all about her. She's the focal point, and she's made so through this juxtaposition. But it's not just her head and upper torso. Vermeer wants to bring attention to what she's doing, using a balance. How does he do this? Put the hand in the center, on a diagonal, and reward it with high contrast. Again, here value contrast. The light fingers of the chiaroscuro hand is set off by the dark picture frame. Note the other hand, much lower contrast situation. So overall, we go first to her upper torso, and her right hand. It's a narrative painting, telling a story. Though the specifics are debated, it falls into the category of the Christian vanitas, works that in one way or another convey the message that life and its pleasures are transient, that the more important reality is eternal life. So she's weighing things. She's poised between the Last Judgment behind her, the riches on the table before her, the mirror reflecting youth and beauty, and the window's light that literally illuminates her. And these are precisely the things that reveal themselves next, again through their relative contrast. You'll note that all the detail in the side plane of the table and the patterned floor beneath it are all brought into more neutral and close value range, less contrast. And everything's tied to the geometry of the format. He's using the color with the organization based on the armature of the rectangle. We get stresses on both the vertical and horizontal halves. And as we've noted, the hand center stage. We even get a stress along the diagonal following her gaze down through the scales to the dark blue drape in the lower left corner. The David is also highly organized. The men form a rectangular aggregate grouping hinged on the center and full of active diagonals. They get the highest saturations and the highest value contrast. And this is set up in relation to the ground. The light arms and swords are framed by the dark behind. Not surprisingly, this defines the focal zone. Put the light thing in a dark environment and we'll look. Same idea as the white stop on the red stop sign. Or in the Vermeer, the large light shape in the woman's upper torso set against the dark ground. The women in the David form a sleepier, more horizontal group. While the men thrust up, the women slump down. Their saturation and value contrast follows suit. Move to the architecture, and saturation and value contrast are reduced even more. We could sum this up as a principle regarding color and composition. If you want the viewer to pay more attention to the objects than the ground, make sure the ground has less contrast of hue, value, and saturation than the objects. That's what David is doing, and Bruegel, and Akins, and Cézanne, and even Mondrian. We've seen that with any palette, no matter the limitations, we can create a visual hierarchy with focal areas and focal points. Equally, within any palette and in any range of hue, value, or saturation demanded by the hierarchy, we can create the illusion of light, space, and volume. Earlier, we noted that distance affects the way we perceive color. With distance, objects take on the color of the atmosphere. And when things are closer to us, their colors appear to have greater value contrast and greater saturation. As they recede, less. A second principle goes like this. All else being equal, warm colors will tend to advance and cools to recede. But saturation will generally trump the effect of warm advancing and cool receding. In other words, a saturated blue bowl, a cool, will easily advance against a neutral warm, say a neutral orange wall and table. And high value contrast can often override high saturation. We see a lot of this at play in the Akins. The warms are predominantly in the foreground. Looking at the water in particular, the foreground's more saturated and has greater value contrast. As we recede, it gets cooler and more neutral, more like the atmosphere, especially the way it appears at the horizon. Because at the horizon, the sky is more neutral. As we move higher in the page and forward in space, the saturation of the blue increases. We see a similar application in the David, though as we recede here, we move into the dark. Forget the figures for a moment. Look at the floor. More saturated and contrast close to the picture plane. More neutral and less value contrast as we recede. Moving back to the columns and the space behind, we get even less saturation and value contrast. At an abstract level, the same thing is happening in the Mondrian. The saturated primary colors advance in front of the neutral white ground. In the next lecture, we'll talk about creating volume and put all this knowledge into practice in some complex drawing projects.